And I need to make sure. And I need to make sure. Oh, there it goes again. Okay. And welcome to Rukmani and to Jessica. Thanks for joining us. All right. Who's moderating the panel? Great. Do we have any welcome slides for today?
I did not make any.
That's fine. We'll just not have them today. Hi, Adam. Oh, Brian. Well, Keaton's not here now.
Yes.
I was going to ask, when do we want to pause the proceedings to have our little hostage holding situation?
I would move for doing that at the beginning of the beginning of wrap up.
So like at 3:30?
Is that when wrap up starts?
Oh, sorry.
I just need to pull up the schedule.
That's 3:30 Eastern time, right?
Yes, that sounds like the right time to execute such questions. Keaton, do you see? I see you nodding.
Yeah.
Can you just give us an overview of how this is going to go and like how questions are going to be asked? Or is there like a chat somewhere, or I just don't really have much context about this.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we're going to get started. I'll introduce all of you, and then we'll go around and have you describe first just a bit about your current position that you're at. We sent some questions around that we plan to ask. We'll just sort of go around asking these a handful of questions, unless the other attendees have questions, and then we'll invite them to open that up and direct those questions to you individually if they're specific, or for anyone to chime in if there are general questions. Does that answer your question?
Sure, yeah. You said there's some questions sent ahead of time. Was that by email or?
Yeah, we emailed, let's see.
Email from Keaton himself, I believe.
Yeah, I think I sent those.
Okay, I see him. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. Hey, Susan, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm fine. And Jim?
And welcome, Rukmani. I think you were not here when I said welcome before.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks so much for volunteering to be on the panel.
Sure, yeah,
I got your email and I was like, this is perfect.
sure.
Connie, could you pronounce your last name for me, please?
It's phonetic. It's Vijaya Raghavan. Vijaya Raghavan.
J.O. Raghavan.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Are you doing the spotlighting thing?
Yep.
I like the spotlighting thing.
All right. I definitely have learned some more advanced Zoom skills this week.
Yep.
Can I ask if you can all hear my kids screaming in the background or not?
No, can't hear.
Okay, good. Because I could go yell at them.
We'll get started in just a minute. Let everyone connect.
I'm gonna go get the links to drop in the chat. As usual. It is the case that people don't see those links, right? If I drop them in the chat before they enter, right? They don't. Yeah, it's so annoying.
right, good morning, everybody. I think it's time to get started. We're starting today, the last day of the AAPF Symposium with our careers panel. Jackie's going to drop some links in the chat for how to access the live stream and also the low latency cart captioning that we have available for our discussion today. So I'd like to introduce our panel. Our panel represents people in a variety of different career pathways in astronomy, in teaching and research, starting with Jessica Kirkpatrick. Jessica is the Director of Data Science at Cobalt Metals. She's formerly worked at Slack, Microsoft, Hired, and Chegg. Susan Mullally is the Deputy Project Scientist for JWST at the Space Telescope Science Institute and was formerly lead for data archiving with TESS at MAST and a scientist at the Kepler Science Office. Rukmani Vijayaraghavan, sorry, I cleared that with you earlier, but messed it up still. Rukmani is the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the DOE. She was formerly the AIP Congressional Science Fellow and an AAPF Fellow. Adam Beardsley is a professor at Winona State University. He was formerly an NSF AAPF Fellow as well, as was Jim Davenport, who is a professor at the University of Washington. Thank you all for joining us today. And I wanted to get started just by going around and having you share just a short summary of what some of your, what a day in the life at your job looks like, what some of your responsibilities are. And can we start with Jessica, please?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Jessica Kirkpatrick, data scientist at Cobalt Metals. My current company is using geoscience data to try to find new sources of the raw materials that go into lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles and personal storage units. So me and my team are creating systems to combine lots of different data sets, from satellite imagery to geochemistry to physics data like gravity and magnetic field data, to try to identify anomalies on the surface of the Earth that are associated with deposits underground. So my day is a lot of making sure that, because I'm a lead, making sure that everyone on my team knows what they should be doing, helping them with prioritizing their work, as well as I am an IC contributor on the satellite data. So putting together systems to ingest large amount of satellite data, process that to find interesting signals, and then feed that into a larger set of algorithms that combines the imagery with other data sources to try to find anomalies. So it's a lot of programming, a lot of data cleaning and data ingestion, and then communicating results to broader stakeholders to make decisions. Yeah, so that's me.
Thank you, Jessica. Susan?
Hi, y'all. So I'm now the deputy project scientist, and I've been in this position for only about 6 months. So I'm still kind of getting my feet wet in exactly what that job means and what it entails. So I'll kind of give a summary of that, as well as my previous job, where I was the kind of the archive operations lead for the TESS mission at the MAST, which is also at Space Telescope Science Institute. So, as the project scientist role, I think a lot about how the teams are communicating between each other, and about how we get that information out to the astronomical community. And, and also trying to find ways to get feedback from the astronomical community to influence what we build and set those priorities for things that happen at Space Telescope, because Space Telescope has, for the James Webb Space Telescope, it has the the operations as well as building a lot of the software and running the mission, and in terms of like running the TAC and all the tools you'd be using and things like this. So so that's what I'm currently thinking about. A year ago at this time, I was primarily thinking about what tools people needed in order to access lots of data at the MAST archive. And so it was a similar role in that way, but it was far more technical in that I needed to think, what were the limits of what people were already able to do, what were tools were astronomers familiar with, and how do we push them to use some of these new tools, how to use like cloud computing to do their astronomy and things like that. So my day-to-day actually in both these roles involved a lot of attending meetings. I'd probably say I am on meetings 40 to 50% of the time on a good week. Finding the right person to talk to at the right time is a lot of what I do. In between, it's reading documents about what people are working on and trying to digest that and to collate it into a coherent picture. I do a lot of that as well. So there's my quick summary.
Thank you, Susan. Rukmani, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rukmani Vijayaraghavan. I was an AAPF from 2015 to 2018, and I actually helped run the symposium in 2017, back in the day when this was all in person. And we actually had a panel on astronomy policy, which is what one of the things that led me down my current career path and why I thought I'd volunteer to talk to current fellows. Anyway, so after the AAPF in 2018, I did an American Institute of Physics Congressional Fellowship, which is run through AAAS. And that was really interesting. Happy to talk about that in more detail. And then after that fellowship, I'm now AAAS Executive Branch Fellow at the Department of Energy. So in DOE, I work in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, which does all of the clean energy work at DOE. And I specifically work on water power technologies. So in that role, a lot of what we do in policy, it's a little bit of policy program oversight. Most of what I do is in what we call innovative financing mechanisms. So these are things like helping run prize competitions to advance new technologies, running solicitations, working university solicitations, graduate fellowships, working with the labs pretty closely on all sorts of commercialization activities for clean energy. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Happy to talk in more detail on all of these things. Right now, a lot of my job is, since we are progressing to, or rather transitioning to a new administration, a lot of what we're doing now is thinking about framing a program and developing materials for the incoming political leadership, which is a process that's still in progress, and especially because the new administration cares deeply about climate change mitigation and clean energy technologies. We're really thinking about how best to use our existing abilities and assets to do that. So yeah, so it's a lot of fun. There's definitely a lot of skills from my time in academia that I still use. And it's also like one of the good things about working in DOE compared to other federal agencies is we're still really connected to the academic world and to the research world through the labs. DOE basically is the largest funder of basic science or scientific research in the United States. And yeah, but now I don't have to actually do research. I just get to help other people do research. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to Adam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Beardsley, also a former fellow. This is actually my first year out of the fellowship program. So I just started as an assistant professor at Winona State University here in Minnesota. It's quite cold right now. So I think like my day-to-day, you can probably have a pretty good guess. I think I'm supposed to be representing the kind of small school path for faculty. So my teaching load is probably significantly higher than what you may be more familiar with at various research institutions that you're at right now. Let's see. So yeah, as a first year professor, my day to day is mostly waking up and trying to figure out what the heck I'm going to talk about in class that day, preparing notes and stuff like that. But let's see. More seriously, work a lot with students. That was kind of what I was looking for in a job, was to find a way to work closely with students a lot. Here there are some graduate programs, but our department is strictly undergraduate. So working with a lot of undergraduate students, looking for projects for them. We do have like research capstone type class that they do. This is also a kind of interesting department. I'm in the physics department, but we are launching an engineering degree within our department. So we're we're working on accreditation right now, and kind of introducing that and kind of thinking about ways to train students to, tackle problems really. I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Just like I said, you probably have a pretty good idea of what I do.
Well, thank you. I'm sure we'll have questions for you. Don't know everything about your jobs, but Jim, could you?
Yeah, I'll round us out. So my name is Jim Davenport. I'm a research professor at the University of Washington. We're a big R1 school, and we have a lot of teaching faculty and teaching, both people who just teach, people who teach and research. And then my job, it's all research, which means I'm soft money, which is fun, and it somewhat maximizes the things that I like in terms of mentoring students, doing research, writing papers, which is the part of the job that I enjoy. But it does have the sort of natural instability of grant funding cycles and worrying about pay. So it's not exactly effortless, but it's a lot of fun. Like Rukmani and Adam, I moved into this job. Like Susan, and Adam, I moved into this job in the last 6 or 8 months. I had been at the University of Washington as a research scientist before, so I got the promotion to professor. I was also an AAPF fellow in the same class as Rukmani, actually, 2015 to 2018. So I've been to a few of these in the real world as well. My daily work right now, I have 2 little kids running around upstairs. So my daily life is mostly taking care of them and a little bit of being a professor. But I imagine that my job will be mostly meeting with students. So right now it's mostly on Zoom. I spend a lot of hours doing research meetings with students and trying to find a few quiet moments to write. And hopefully that will be maximized post-pandemic, where I can do a little more writing and a lot more meeting with students. It's a big department. We also have a few institutes in our department, including the DIRAC Institute, the Data Intensive Research in Astrophysics and Cosmology, which is associated and affiliated with the LSST project at Vera Rubin Observatory. So we have a bunch of software people and a bunch of data science people, and I'm the associate director of the DIRAC Institute. So I spend a bit of my time worrying about how that institute is running and being funded as well. So yeah, I'm kind of representing the big school frame of reference, but I'm also a research professor, so I'm not teaching. So I can't really speak to what that load is like. But I'm happy to talk about my journey as a AAPF fellow and beyond.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. And I want to invite questions from the panelists now. You can raise your hands or you can type questions in the chat. I'll give you a second for anyone to jump in with a question before I ask one of my own. But just go ahead and raise your hands throughout this if you have questions for anyone in particular or in general. Here we have one from Abby. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Brief question for Adam. What is your teaching kind of schedule or calendar like? Like how many courses do you teach over a year versus per semester? And did you have any teaching, like any instructor of record teaching experience before you took this job? Because I've been finding that is a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, so my teaching load, let me think of how to phrase it. So I have 24, I forget the term that we use, but per year it's 24 credits roughly, which means that I'm in the class about 12 hours a week. So the 2 semesters add up to 24. That, it's give or take because labs don't count as like 1-to-1. So it's not quite like that.
So it's
but
not quite 3 a semester, but something like that?
it's just about 3 classes per semester.
Okay.
But the difficulty in that is that so our intro classes, we don't have graduate TAs, right? So professors are teaching
Right.
everything.
Yep.
So the intro labs, I teach some just intro labs without the lecture. And a different professor is teaching the lecture. So the accounting is a little bit funny, but if I was teaching my own classes, it would be about 3 classes per semester. In fact, I believe that's what I have on tap in the fall next year. So I have to double check what I'm teaching. So it's a lot of teaching. It's one of the higher ends of teaching loads that I saw when I was on the market looking around at other teaching schools too. It's a heavy load. And as far as being a instructor of record, I did have one experience actually when I was a graduate student. I went to the University of Washington, and Seattle Pacific University is right there in Seattle, and they needed somebody for a semester. So I was able to cover a couple of sections of kind of calculus-based intro physics classes, and I was the instructor of record for that. I think that helped like kind of get my resume up there. I'm not sure if it really was much to like tip me over in any sense. I think that like it's just a nice thing to have. I don't think it's necessarily required. I think people recognize it's difficult to get. Probably the more important thing is to try to just seek out as many teaching opportunities as you can. So I did a lot of guest lecturing and a lot of student mentoring.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Yep.
All right, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, this question is for any and all the panelists. If you think back to the time when you were in a similar position, whether you were an AAPF fellow or a postdoc or sort of at that point in your career, is there any single thing you did, an activity, a research choice or a career choice you made that was particularly important to putting you in the position that you are now?
Suppose I could start. I stumbled into my career. So the thing I did was apply for a job that my fiance had applied for, be it or not. And we both ended up at Kepler as a result. Prior to that, I was thinking of going back into undergraduate teaching because I really enjoyed, for 3 years, I taught at a small liberal arts college, and before I jumped over into doing research again. And so I was still looking to go back into that until I saw these, that time series data. Yeah, I know loads about that. I could do that job. And so I ended up applying and getting that. And that sent me down this career path. So maybe not the answer you were looking for, but you have to be open for different opportunities that come up because you never know what you might like.
I can chime in. Oh,
go ahead, Romana. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I did a lot of things that were not like in addition to my research that led me down this path. So, as part of the EAPF, which has a pretty significant outreach component, I ran this workshop for girls in science. And I also did the AAS Congressional Visits Day because I was like, Congress is cool. I want to see what all this is. And so like doing work other than research that kind of proves that you can talk to other people. In addition to being a good scientist and a researcher, you also have skills and abilities that help you communicate or show that you have an interest in the world outside. I think that really helped me to get to where I am.
I was gonna say I did my AAPF at a small college. It was kind of like what Adam's describing. It was all undergrads, and so I did a lot of student mentoring as a postdoc, which I think was really beneficial. It meant that I had a lot of projects going, and it gave me a lot of sort of leadership experience. And the other benefit was the grants office was just basically one person, and she was amazing. And so I really miss having that experience of having like one dedicated competent person who helped me get my grant submitted. And so I applied to several things as a postdoc, which our postdocs here at the Big R1 have, I think, a lot harder experience getting that kind of direct engagement with grant writing. So grant writing and student project design, I think, were the two things that have benefited me now years later.
I think for me, I have been pretty fearless around networking and trying to leverage even very like peripheral people in my circle to try to understand what they do and how that could be interesting to me. My first data science job I got because my sister's roommate worked at or former roommate worked at a company, and she offered to set us up with a phone call, and that turned into a job. So I think it's easier to network within the astronomy community, academic community, because you're at conferences and you're regularly interacting with folks. But for me, wanting to go into industry, I really had to try to leverage other connections to learn about jobs and what careers were like outside of astronomy, and also to help get that into getting my early jobs.
I think for me, it's sort of what I've already mentioned in the answer to the last question, just mentoring students. I did a lot of that as a postdoc, getting them involved with projects, grant writing too. And actually, I just want to mention this because Jim mentioned the sponsored project office with one person, which is what we have here. It's one guy who is also our women's track and field coach. So it's a very, very intimate setting. So it's yeah, I've been writing a bunch of stuff with him. And yeah, I think just kind of getting involved with students as much as possible is helpful for me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. We have any other questions? Not right now, then I'd like to ask, you know, we have a range of career paths here. What could we do now as postdocs to make ourselves, you know, more competitive in your kind of field direction, or you know, what could we do to really stand out as an applicant applying for a job like you have? This is for all of you. Just chime in, please.
As a soft money professor, the obvious answer is get money, which is of course easily said and quite difficultly done at times. But the most important thing for me, the most important decision or thing that's led me down this path was being really clear in my mind about what my career and life values were and how those things intersected. This is not necessarily the job that I dreamed of in grad school or even as a postdoc, but it satisfies a lot of really strict constraints I have on like my life and my lifestyle, particularly with regard to the two little monsters upstairs and where we are. And so for me, it was geography, and that became the most deciding factor. And so figuring out how to work geography into my career became like the #1 driver. And so we haven't had a tenure track hire at this university in a few years, and there's only one big university in town doing astronomy. And so figuring out how to stay in the field as long as I can while it's still fun, but making that balance of my life has been the most important thing. And so my suggestion to you all, if you haven't, and I would find it remarkable if anybody hasn't at this point in their career, but if you haven't thought seriously about where you want to live and what you want the next 10 years of your life to look like, this pandemic would be a wonderful opportunity to have that reflection.
Yeah, for me, it was, I mean, I just want to echo what Jessica said. It was a little bit of networking and finding the kind of people who had career paths similar to what I was on. So at some point during my postdoc, I realized there was a very, very tiny probability that I would end up being an R1 professor. And, even as an AAPF, such a tiny fraction of professional astronomers end up becoming that. And all my career, I'd been like trained to think that that was the only thing I could aspire to. And then I met a number of former astronomers who were doing fellowships in policy in DC or had done fellowships in DC. And that kind of sparked this idea of like, oh, right, so this sounds cool and interesting. And I talked to more people who had really interesting experiences doing this. And then I had about a year on my postdoc. I still applied for faculty positions, but I also did things to set me up for this, for Plan B, which eventually ended up becoming Plan A. In again, doing things like the Congressional Visits Day, I volunteered with this nonprofit called 500 Women Scientists on women in STEM. And just being open to the fact that there are many other careers besides being a tenured professor from which you could find intellectual fulfillment and also stability. I mean, I'm still a fellow, so it's not stable, but I have a much better idea of what my future career is going to look like. And I plan to stay in DC for the foreseeable future. So
There was a question for you in the chat about whether you were in DC prior to your fellowships there.
No, I was a postdoc at UVA in Charlottesville, so it was not too far away, which kind of helped with traveling up to DC regularly, mostly for touristy things, but yeah, for things like Congressional Visits Day, it helped a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I would just be thoughtful about the types of skills that you can build that will be useful during your postdoc, but that also are widely applicable on a variety of types of work. And so communication, writing grants, being able to do coding and technical things in a language that is widely used, teaching. So making sure that you're balancing your research work and publishing papers with developing this broader set of skills that will then open up other opportunities for you. I think that you can be pushed towards being very, very singly focused when you're a researcher, and that can then make it hard for you to pivot if you decide that you want to be open to other paths.
I guess I can add, I agree with everything that you all have been saying so far, especially Jessica, you do need to really think about what those skills are that you can sell to a broader community, that's for sure. And like recently we just hired at MAST, and I can say that some of the main things we were looking for was that they have those things like Python skills, or have you worked with a database, but on top of that, we're looking for people who've like led teams. So even if you just organize a conference, a small conference, that kind of thing shows through as someone who can pull people together and get something done. And so that was the kind of thing. On top of that, for places like if you're trying to be a scientist for an institute like Space Telescope, we look for people who look beyond their own science. Like, what can you serve for the entire community? And do you have a mindset for that, instead of just what's important for my narrow little piece of research? And that's a harder one to figure out how to get it onto your resume. But one of the ways I've noticed people doing that is, for instance, like creating a large database or products that you have made sure are publicly available to other people in various ways, and you can advertise that this is being used by people beyond even your own research. That's kind of one way that we see that happening.
I was just going to echo what Jim said about, life constraints and things can be very important. And if you're applying to a small school like where I'm at, they want to make sure that you're a good fit, not necessarily that you're producing world-class research. In fact, if you are, they may not even think that they can actually hold on to you. So it's really about, well, I should put an asterisk on this because I've never been on the other side of the table. I haven't hired anyone, But I think it's very important that you can convince them that you are a good fit for the school. So understanding the school that you're applying to, geography is a big thing. In somewhat rural Minnesota, they want to believe that you really want to be here. And any other pieces of that there might be, being able to fit in with the program, being able to bring your research to the students so you can engage them.
Thanks so much. I've got a question that's maybe relevant to a few of you, but it's based on what Jim said about having some geographical considerations, and in particular wanting to sort of stay at the institution that you were at and being able to find an opportunity, or maybe help create an opportunity for that to happen for yourself. And Susan, for example, has transitioned from one role at Space Telescope to another conveniently. Are there any, for those of you who have these experiences, managing to stay where you want to be? Do you have any advice for how to make that happen? That seems like such a difficult thing for many of us to imagine, I think, in this field, that we're just going to be subject to the job market.
I think you have to be very open to what the available paths will be, right? Like you can. It was told to me that you can either really constrain the kind of job you want or where you want it, but probably not both. And so I think, at least in my case, it's being really clear about what I'm interested and willing to do as an astronomer, and what I'm not. I think there are other opportunities that I could have in this geographic constraint, but they're not things that I'm interested in doing. I've also never been afraid to leave astronomy. I think that's the other part. I did an internship at Microsoft as a grad student, and so there's a lot of academic intellectual fulfillment out there. I know the kind of things that Jessica's working on are super exciting and interesting to me. I did the Congressional Visit Day as a postdoc as well, and so what Rukmani's doing is really interesting to me. There's a lot of space for intellectual fulfillment, and so I was really clear with myself about I want a job where I'm doing research, and I want to do it in Seattle. And so as long as I'm doing that, that's great. And the minute that runs out, I'm looking for a different opportunity. And I think that maximal flexibility is what you have to have. But that requires a level, I think, of deep reflection and humility, because we have a lot of ego built up in what we think we're doing and where we think we're going. And when you start applying to things and you get a lot of rejections and you realize that that's the only thing you can apply to, that becomes pretty hard to digest at times.
Yeah, and sorry, Jessica. There you go. Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, we in astronomy and in academia compare ourselves to everyone else in the field, and but when you go out into the outside world, especially in a place like DC, like being a PhD scientist is a big deal, and a lot of people really respect that. And calling yourself Dr. Vijayaraghavan, like most of the people I work with are not PhD scientists, and they're all incredibly smart people, which is also another thing you realize when you're outside of the academic environment. But yeah, you realize how broad your skills are, in whether it's in data analytics, whether it's in writing, whether it's in just all those years of slogging through and writing papers really does pay off in fields outside of academia. And yeah, and in terms of geographic constraint, I guess DC is the one exception where you can both do the job you want in policy and stay in DC if you want to, just because so much of policy making is concentrated here. That being said, I mean, now with things being remote, of course, you can do a lot of things from wherever you are. So that's all.
So I talk to a lot of people who are trying to transition into tech from academia, and seems like the biggest challenge is more of an emotional or self-perception transition that needs to happen versus actually missing doing research or missing astronomy. People are very attached to the identity of being an astronomer or a scientist, more so than the actual day-to-day of what they are doing, or missing that actual intellectual pursuit. And so, for me, once I decided that I could be really satisfied and excited about my day-to-day, even more so than when I was doing astronomy research, by doing something else, that really opened up the possibilities for me. And I think that I'll speak for myself. I think that I was slightly brainwashed when I was in academia to think that that was the only thing that I could do that would be fulfilling and the only thing that would make me happy. And it was a release and a relief to be able to think about other things. It did free me up to be able to stay in the Bay Area. I had gone to Berkeley and I wanted to stay here. It also has given me a lot of financial freedom. Academia doesn't pay as well as industry. And that, is not something that was really a motivator for me when I was choosing jobs, but it is really nice to not have to be worried about money constantly, which I was when I didn't even realize it at the time, but that was a big stressor for me when I was in school and in academia. So that's another piece that has been really freeing for me personally.
All right, thanks so much. We have some hands up, so I'll ask Christina to please ask your question.
Yeah, hi. So my question is about maybe something that applies a little bit more to the academia side, but for like a lot of faculty proposals, it seems like you're always, kind of asked to provide the next big thing and the next big idea. And I just wanted to hear what you all had done in terms of the creative process for that. Like, was it, I guess like in part of the mechanics for it, but also like, how do you balance what you're doing now as an AAPF versus how to prepare for the next big thing and get your idea so that it's, you can convince a faculty panel that it's feasible and they should, give you the startup money to do it.
I'm looking at you, Adam. I want to know what you have to say.
Well, as one of the two people still in academia, I guess, I don't know if I have an answer to that. I did apply to a lot of R1 schools, and I was actually never successful there. So I don't know if I can really answer how to pitch that next big idea. I did do a whole lot of just pretending I already was a professor when I was a postdoc. Trying to serve on committees and do different things that would make it look like I can just fit into the role right away. And sometimes I felt like that kind of hindered my ability to keep producing high quality research. So I had a few roles that ate up a whole lot of time. And I don't know, that's just the way that fell. So I'm gonna let Jim answer now.
Okay. Well, I'm not in a teaching role, so I don't know how to balance all of that. And spoiler, research professors get essentially no startup money, so that's a bummer. But I do stress a lot about the imposter syndrome feeling of are my ideas good and transformative still? I feel like I had a good idea for my AAPF, and I worry a lot about have I had another good idea since. I think I've had a couple, but I think what I've seen from the last few hires that we've done. One of the prevailing, we say we want transformative research, but really what we want is faculty to bring in grants with some regular cadence, not every single year, and mentor students. My observation from the first 6 months of being a professor is the faculty are hilariously overworked and stressed out, which is not a great thing. And what they're often looking for is someone who is going to lighten the load. And so what you're trying to convince the faculty panel or review people who are looking through applications is that that you're going to be able to do research and sustain a group and bring in some level of research funding, so the college will be happy and everybody will have some money, but that you'll also be able to like teach that class that nobody wants to teach, or you'll be able to take 3 or 4 students, because that is a burden that, you know, nobody wants to have 10 grad students, as wonderful as they are. That's just too many. And so kind of as Adam said, pretending to be a professor is sort of a helpful mindset of talking about like what you intend to teach very concretely. What I, I don't think there's a lot of jobs at most universities, even at big R1s, that they're hiring just because they think that you're going to win that Nobel Prize. Like if you have the Nobel Prize winning idea, then that's great. You should lead with that. But other than that, I think it's about having a sustainable career and having a research trajectory that you're conceivably going to be writing papers 5 years, 10 years from now.
I would just chime in that those ideas that you write down to get those jobs are great, and they're to let people to get to know you. Just like Jim was saying, no one's going to hold you to them. Get that out of your head. Like you're so used to like feel like you're promising things, and it's not really about that. So you know, think a little bigger than you might have. I mean, definitely, you know, aim on some feasibility to it, but you know, definitely, you know, do a big brainstorm and really think outside the box if you need to.
Thanks.
All right, need to unmute. We got a question from Jackie.
Hey, and I just want to point out that we have some questions in the chat as well that have gotten lost from Abby and from, I think, Sherwood. But wait, what do you mean they're not going to hold us to that? It feels like a promise that I'm going to do these things. Do you mean they're not going to hold us to that? That wasn't the question I was going to ask, but now you said that, so I'm going to ask it.
You should write in the direction of what you're interested in working on, for sure. But I find that once you end up in these positions, I mean, I'm not a research faculty, so I know I'm speaking a little bit, but I still do play in the research world, and did have to write a research statement even for my current job. And you tend to write these vision things, but then you get in with a team and you start talking to people, and ideas change and your priorities change. And so that's okay. That's what's supposed to happen. I find most
because I feel guilt when that happens.
Don't feel guilt. That's the process.
Okay. I did want to ask Jessica and Rukmani about their day-to-day, actually. Like what do you do?
I can go. Honestly, it's a combination of just a ton of meetings, especially more now that we're all remote. And it's all sorts of meetings, from like internal meetings with just a couple of people checking on progress, to like big meetings with like lab researchers, to like all hands meetings across the office. And like, I would say like 3/4 of them are a waste of time, but it's right. And like the most productive work that I do is on days when I don't have any meetings. And that kind of work involves like sitting down and writing memos or solicitations, thinking through long-term strategies, thinking some of it is making presentations to and briefing decks for like leadership, for higher level political appointees. I'm also, some of what we're trying to do is combine lessons learned across DOE and thinking about how DOE can best use financing mechanisms to support innovation and research in all sorts of clean energy technologies. So it's a combination of writing things, presenting things. It's also a lot of reviewing solicitations. So now that I'm on the other side of the federal funding process, so we run everything from postdoctoral fellowships to big research grants and funding opportunities, and like running review panels, working with our communications team, getting selections approved by higher level leadership as needed, working with reviewers, including being a reviewer myself, and compiling these, thinking through review criteria, which is something that we can do with prize competitions, and thinking about writing review criteria in a way that incentivize the results, the kind of results and technologies that we at DOE want to see. Yeah, so all of those things don't happen in a single day, but these are the kinds of things that I do say during a typical week or month. Yeah.
So yeah, at my current role, I lead a team. And so part of my responsibilities are around leading the more junior folks on my team, growing the team, supporting the team, planning for what we're going to do in the future. I'm hiring, so check out jobs at cobaltmetals.com. And then at my company, we also expect everyone to also have their own kind of individual contributor contributions that they're doing to the code base for me as a data scientist. So I'm responsible for some of our software that is doing predictions of and probabilistically trying to determine where there are deposits. And so getting data into our system, augmenting, figuring out the right training data, trying to tune our ML to, and then get feedback from our geologists. We're planning a field program this summer where we're going to send people up to one of the sites that we have mineral rights to, and figuring out how we can create systems that will incorporate data that they're collecting real time to influence what they're going to be spending the next day or week looking at. So building out that system and kind of simulating what we imagine they might be collecting to then, put it through a system to do the real-time predictions. So yeah, it's fun. It's a combination of actual research and science and coding, and then like kind of broader team lead organizational work.
All right, thank you. We did have a question from Sherwood. Sherwood, would you like to ask that question?
Sure. Yeah, I just some people were talking about how to create opportunities where you are if you want to stay where you are. And I have the opposite problem. How do you create opportunities where you're not if you know you don't want to stay?
I feel like depending on the situation, that might be the same question. It's a matter of, finding opportunities in a given location and being flexible in what you're willing to do. I think that like things like networking and being open to different opportunities is probably the best bet. Both of those things. I don't know, but
I guess perhaps maybe it would be good to ask for the. I don't know how each of you applied for your jobs. I know for Adam, you mentioned that you applied to a bunch of different jobs, and did any of you apply to like a single job? Like that's the like you really targeted where you were going, or is everybody here like the only thing that works is the shotgun approach?
I should mention that I was pretty specific about location. So right. I applied to a range of jobs, actually, and outside of academia as well, but was specific to the Midwest.
I only applied to 2 jobs at the same university, not in the same department either. So I think your question about like opportunities elsewhere, I agree with Adam. It's kind of the same question about opportunities in the same place. The real question is for you, Sherwood, is are you targeting somewhere that you're not specifically, like you're in place X and you really want to be in place Y, or is it just anywhere but X? Those are different optimizations.
A little bit of both. A lot of people really love the Bay Area. I don't really, but
sure.
That was my situation. I wanted out of the Bay Area. So it was too expensive to live there. And I didn't see any ability to to get the jobs that would require me to, have the means to stay there. So I was anywhere but there. And the year I applied for the job that brought me out to Baltimore, I think I applied for 3 jobs and 2 were in DC and 1 was in Baltimore. So they were doing similar things though at that time. And I had the option to stay where I was for another year. So I know I didn't have to put out loads of jobs. So that's part of it as well, right? You need to look at how much risk you're taking on by targeting a couple jobs.
Yeah, I did a combination of both. So in my final year of the fellowship, I applied to a bunch of postdocs, as we all do, and faculty positions, but I also really wanted to take the policy career path in DC seriously. And so I applied to both the congressional fellowships and two congressional fellowships and the executive fellowship. And I got both the executive and the congressional, and being in Congress was just so much more interesting and cool at the time. So I took the congressional fellowship, and then once I came to DC, I knew I wanted to stay here. And there are ways to do that, whether it's in the executive branch or in working in policy in the wider DC world. So it's really hard to know, to kind of demystify this world and the city if you're outside, but once you're kind of in the system, you have a better understanding of how things work. And since then, I have not applied to jobs outside DC, and I don't think I will in the foreseeable future. So.
Okay, great. Thanks. We have a couple other hands up. I'll just mention that Jessica says that they have to go at the top of the hour. So be sure to get any questions in there. The rest of you are welcome to hang around for a few extra minutes if you want to chat into our coffee break, but certainly you don't have to. Paul, do you have a question?
Jackie, you might have been before me. Do you want to go first?
I already asked a question, so you can go first.
Oh, okay. My question's for Jessica. What is the biggest mistake you see people coming from physics and astronomy and academia making when they try to transition to data science?
Yeah, so I would say one big mistake is a certain amount of arrogance in the application process of making it clear that you see this as a backup choice, or that we should be really lucky to get somebody who could be an academic to want to grace us with their presence at our company. That doesn't go over particularly well. Yeah, and then just not doing much effort to understand the specifics of what my company does and how their previous experience could map to the work that they would do at my company. I had tons of interviews with folks in the past where it was clear that they did not even read the website to understand the very basics of the business model of what our company is doing. And that, just doesn't show that you're particularly passionate or interested about the role. Interviewing is much like dating, even if it's not your first choice or you're not 100% sure about the person, you want to at least put that good foot forward and make them feel special in the moment. Otherwise, why would they want to continue spending time with you? So at least have a good way to kind of pitch yourself and why you're interested in the transition, and why you're specifically interested in working for the company that you're interviewing for, even if it in reality is not actually your first choice. Also will say that Jeff Silverman, who has also made this transition and is now a data scientist, is on the line, and he's offered to kind of tag team when I have to leave, and he has a lot of great input as well on his experience. So yeah, you can ask him questions at the coffee break after I go.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Jeff. Jackie, do you have another question?
Yeah, Jessica, I have some friends who, have transitioned over or have actually been hiring academics into various coding related jobs. And one of the things I complain about is that academics and astronomers and physicists in particular have kind of grotty code skills. I didn't necessarily learn object-oriented programming. My commenting is perhaps a bit grotty. So I'm kind of wondering, in your position, when you're hiring someone, what kind of concrete skills, would I need to have on my CV to make this kind of transition and be appealing to you as a person hiring me?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a broad range of experiences that academics have in the way that they develop software, from it being something that is a like single long script that they run on their computer that is very hard to dissect or for other people to use, to contributing to peer-reviewed code bases where a large group of people are using your code. Obviously, candidates who are more towards that latter description are more appealing because that's the way that tech companies work. And so, I would recommend that if you aren't doing that, to at least start to try to familiarize yourself with some best practices of, hey, how do you use Git? How do you collaborate on code? How do you test your code? How do you get feedback on your code? Maybe start doing that within your research group with other students or postdocs to try to start to get some of those practices. Maybe work on a hackathon project over a weekend so that you can get practice doing this with people who are more experienced in this type of code development. It's not rocket science. It's not actually that hard, but it is a way of working that is different than the way a lot of scientists are currently working. And it really helps if people are familiar with that and can kind of demonstrate that way of designing their code prior to a transition. I always look at people's GitHubs if they have them. Most scientists have pretty dismal looking GitHubs that do not show any real impressive code. So if you can have something, even if it's a side project, that you can demonstrate some good coding practices, that can really set you apart versus somebody who has a GitHub that doesn't have really anything. Also trying to contribute to public libraries. There's AstroPi, but there's also other libraries that you can contribute to, and contributing to the open source community is a way to learn some of these practices.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to thank all of you for joining today on this panel and speaking to us about your career trajectories and the types of things that we may be able to look forward to for ourselves at some point. We're at the top of the hour pretty much, so feel free to run off. We're going to have a 15-minute coffee break starting here shortly. And so if you want to stick around and chat a little less formally, you're welcome to do that as well. But thanks from all of us. Appreciate it.
And for the panelists staying on, now is the historical show off children and/or pets and/or plants portion of the schedule. My dog's not in here right now.
I do have a question, if you'd like to answer, about, Jessica sort of asked about, or was asked about what red flags there are, what kind of things not to do to get a position in that field, maybe acting like you're blessing them with your presence or having really terrible coding practices. But for your career directions, are there, red flags, horrible, horrible choices to be made in policy? Can you be an outspoken political dissenter? Can you, if you take, I know people who have taken 3rd, 4th, 5th postdocs trying to just stay in the game. They're diminishing returns at this point. What don't you want to do to get where you are?
Yeah, so in policy, it's interesting, right? Because there are 2 different versions of this. So in Congress and in a congressional fellowship, you obviously need to pick a side, right? I mean, to be blunt, you cannot be apolitical if you want to work in Congress. And once you pick a side, then that's kind of your team for good. And for me, that was not difficult. Like always been a Democrat, so this was not a complicated question for me. And honestly, for like most other science policy fellows end up working for Democrats in Congress. I think there are maybe 1 or 2 a year, or rather between 0 to 2 a year that work for Republican members of Congress. But at the same time, you need to understand that once you're in Congress, you're working for the member of Congress. It's not about your political priorities. And even if you are mostly on their side, you wouldn't necessarily agree with every single one of the decisions. And that's fine, that's okay. But your job is still to provide the best possible policy advice to them. And in the executive branch, it's a little different, right? Because unless you're a political appointee, you do not work, you work for the American people. You don't work for a specific person or a specific administration. And so there are specific like restrictions on what kind of political speech you can do that's governed by the Hatch Act. But also every agency and every office within an agency sort of has its own political character, I would say. So it's different. So you can kind of, you can still whatever you want to do, whatever you want to do in your personal life. It's just, it's a little different at work.
I have a question along those lines. Have you ever heard of a science advisor type position for state governments? Because like I live in Michigan and I live in the capital of Michigan and I would like to not move again.
I don't know about Michigan, but some states do. So California has
California is big, right? They're practically their own country.
I know that more states are bringing these positions on, so I would just keep an eye out. So I know Idaho recently launched a science policy fellowship. New Jersey has one.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah,
I will keep an eye out.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Silverman, who's taken the baton from Jessica as our representative data scientist. Jeffrey, can you talk a little bit about yourself? I think you've done panels like this in the past, right?
Yeah. So I was in AAPF. I was trying to remember the years. I think it was 12 to 15 in there somewhere. 2 Seattle AASs ago, I was one of the organizers of the symposium. So what was that, like 2014, I think? I was trying to calculate that. But anyway, in the before times. After my AAPF, I left academia, did the Insight Data Science Fellowship Program, and then got a job through that in the Bay Area in San Francisco at a TV analytics startup called Samba TV. I've been there for a little over 4 years and now a director of data science and analytics and do lots of these kinds of panels. Also, for those who were at the recent AAS, I was one of the co-organizers of the Astronomers Turn Data Scientists Splinter Session, which is its own cool thing to help bridge this gap. And you guys get the sort of more concentrated version at the AAPF Symposium, but it's a similar idea. So yeah, I'm happy to pick up from Jess and I, who go way back to our Berkeley days. And she's been we've been doing these kinds of things for a long time. So there you go.
Jeff, does the Insight Fellowship no longer exist?
It is on hiatus. Lots of us think that it is permanent hiatus for whatever kind of oxymoron that might be. But yeah, like many businesses, COVID hit them pretty hard in a number of weird ways. It's a little bit strange because their, data science and those kinds of big data tech jobs did slow down with the entire economy, but did kind of bounce back pretty well. And with this whole idea of people working from home and being able to work anywhere in the country or world, big name companies are becoming even more friendly to that kind of model. And so they're opening up even bigger, broader, pipelines for interviewing and for hiring, which is awesome. And, speaks to a good step in the right direction for diversity and inclusion in many different aspects and axes. And so, I was a little surprised to see that Insight was having trouble. I think just for a variety of reasons that kind of overlapped in an unfortunate period of time, they just couldn't make it work. So yeah, they don't exist as a, training or placement program currently. They support their alums at some level, but that's about it for now.
I guess a related question. that any of you could answer is, since we've mentioned the before times, in the now after times or the during times, how has your job been altered by COVID?
It's really hard to do. I get to work about 3 hours a day on it most days. We get a little bit of grandparent coverage to watch. Yeah, to watch the kids, but it's a really hard time to do my job, and it feels like a lost year academically.
Yeah, since I'm just starting, I don't have a lot to compare to. But like all of my colleagues say, this is like by far the hardest year they've ever had. So it's tough in teaching. Everyone's like rethinking all of their classes and having to like come up with new lesson plans and new strategies for content delivery.
It's been weird. There's some things where the job hasn't changed much at all because Space Telescope for a while has been split between 2 buildings. And so we had all these meetings that were just, it was with everybody internal to the company, but they'd still be completely virtual. And so that didn't change. Now you're just at home instead, and everybody's virtual instead of having like 2 conference rooms talking to each other. So in some ways that was an improvement. But mostly the hardest part I find is that you just want to have 5-minute conversations with people, and like Slack is just not a replacement for it as much as we like to pretend it is. And so it's just hard to have that, like the way communication frequently work, it seems like, is by gossip more than anything else. And without that, it's just like you feel like you're missing out on everything that's going on. And especially as I walked into this new role in a whole new section of the Institute, it feels like I'm wandering around blind and deaf because I just don't know where these conversations are happening anymore. So I sympathize with the whole starting a new job in the middle of this pandemic. It's not easy.
Yeah, I was in this position for about 5 to 6 months before the pandemic. And yeah, it's still like, I agree with everything Susan said. Like, it's just more, communication is just more complicated and difficult. And it's a lot more like, playing telephone. Things are just, while at the same time, it somehow feels like we have more to do than ever. I wonder if that's just because like communication is slower, but you definitely work longer hours because there's no commute anymore, but somehow work never ends. And even though in theory this job has a lot more like, it's more 9 to 5, you have your weekends back, but that's less so during work from home. But at the same time, like there's a lot, there's a lot of good things. Like I don't have to teach, I don't have to do a lot of other things that are necessary in person. So I guess mixed.
I find it interesting. Some of your responses have used the words like I don't have to do these these things, which in some cases are primary responsibilities of other of you have specific interests.
There's been a lot of choosing, like, to not do things that you might have done optionally. Like, I have the choice to take on students, and it was like, no, not right now, not when I have to watch my kids and do school with them. So I said no to that this year. That kind of thing happens a lot right now.
I agree. It's been really hard to say no to a lot of, I've had so many inquiries from undergrads who have been interested in doing work because they also are missing all those casual opportunities to meet with faculty and get research experiences. No. And so having to say no to just so many of those students who are just looking for opportunities to advance their own careers that I want to support has been really disappointing.
So thinking about how we are all we have so much less time now than we had before. And I've been trying to think of how to put this question, and I'm not sure I have it down yet, but the transition, so I am very geographically constricted. My kids are getting older, and it's, moving them from, their current schools that they loved somewhere else seems like something that I'm very uninterested in doing. And I don't know at what point do I, it takes time to figure out and then to be good at something else, right? So at what point do you decide I'm gonna do all the applications in October, and hopefully I'll find out by February or March or something, and then it's like, okay, so then do you at that point, do you give up? Do you go on and start to like hone the other skills that you would be happy doing those other things, but since they're not the thing you're choosing, you haven't really developed them yet. You've got a CV, you don't have a resume, you haven't attended the industry seminars and the networking things and all of the other time-consuming aspects of being part of a university that they offer you these things. But for goodness sakes, yeah, you have like 3 hours a day to work, and I just don't know when do you do all of this? We're supposed to, be doing all of our research and, teaching our kids kindergarten and at the same time also develop a completely new skill as a backup. What the hell?
I don't have an answer, but honestly, just be kinder to yourself. Nobody has it all together. Nobody's doing well. I mean, I don't have kids or other responsibilities, but I'm having a hard enough time just dealing with my own life. Yeah, it's
I
fine.
am a lot of responsibility for myself also.
Yeah.
I will say, if you're still in the fellowship, it's a very flexible time. I don't know. I'll speak with absolutely no authority from the NSF, but if the last 6 months of your fellowship you use doing skill development for your next job instead of finishing the last paper, no one's gonna come back and like ask for the money back.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I'll also point out that the fact that everyone here, well, at least all of the fellows, are NSF AAPF fellows, you're 90% of the way to becoming a data scientist in industry, period, full stop. Don't care if you think that you're a terrible coder, if your resume looks or your CV looks horrible and lists every publication you've ever made, etc. You're 90% of the way there, full stop.
Is the other 10% learning how to do some machine learning? Because I've never used it, because it's not necessary for my research, because I believe in using the appropriate tools, and it's not the appropriate tool.
So good point, Abby. I think part of that 10% is taking one online course in basic machine learning.
Okay, so like machine learning and like SQL, and then I'm there?
Yeah, I would want to take a look at your CV and help you convert it to a resume. But
of course, yeah. But SQL is, so I want to learn SQL, but I just don't have the bandwidth right now to pick up a side project. And I've never done machine learning because it's not necessary for me. I think it's great. I'm not trying to be against it. I just haven't used it. Cool, thanks.
Keaton, are you raising your hand, or are you trying to get us back on schedule?
Raising my hand to get us all back on schedule. I want to thank the panel.
We still have a minute on my clock.
We have a minute. We got to switch over chairs, and so just thanks everybody for chiming in and letting us know about your careers.
I'm in the Slack if people want to continue chatting in there as well. So
thanks for popping in, Jeffrey. Thank you everyone for showing up. This was like a really great panel.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody.
Jim, what is the child's name?
You want to say your name?
William.
William.
Hi, William.
And the other one is Robbie. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Okay, hopefully folks are back from break, and we'll, again, all of our panelists are gone now, but are almost all gone. Thanks for being here, and there we have one more series of talks, and I think we're gonna mostly hear about exoplanet science, which will be a great way to close out. And so we'll start with Keaton. Are you there? I know you're there, but okay, and we see your slides.
Yeah, does that look all right?
They look great.
Super. All right. Well, thank you. I want to tell you a bit about my ongoing work to detect planets transiting white dwarf stars in data from the Zwicky Transient Facility. So first, to put this in the context of stellar evolution, here's a little bit of a review slide. Only about 2% of stars go through this massive stellar evolution track, ending up as black holes or neutron stars. And then like brown dwarfs aren't really stars and black dwarfs aren't really real. And so to first order, pretty much all stars end up as white dwarfs at the end of their lifetime. And then in an exoplanet context, we now know, thanks primarily to transit photometry from Kepler, that virtually all main sequence stars host exoplanets. This is just one such result where redder colors indicate a higher occurrence of planets with different combinations of radii and orbital period around F, G, and K type stars. And it's really colorful. So like overall, there's lots of planets out there. So to review, there's lots of planets. Most stars become white dwarfs. There's lots of planets. Most stars become white dwarfs. Lots of planets. Most stars become white dwarfs. I suspect that most white dwarfs host planets, and this is backed up by a variety of observations. In particular, about 25 to 50% of white dwarfs have metal polluted atmospheres, so we can see in their spectra. White dwarfs have such strong gravities that metal should quickly diffuse below the photosphere. So finding metals in the photospheres of so many white dwarfs really indicates that there's a lot of ongoing accretion of planetesimal debris around white dwarf stars. This is a recent example from Ben Kaiser and company of a white dwarf spectrum that has lithium and potassium in it. In addition, around 2% of white dwarfs exhibit infrared excesses from caused by the presence of a dusty debris disk. There's likely debris disks are likely much more common than that, and only around 2% are detectable. This is a nice colorful graphic from Spitzer. And then finally, there are a few examples now of disintegrating planetesimal bodies around individual white dwarfs. Here are some of my own older observations of planetesimals transiting around a 4.5 hour period, the star WD 1145. And you can even see the depths, shapes of the transits changing over a sequence of days. And so I'll describe some newer such systems like this shortly. But that is all just to back up that white dwarfs likely host planets. Take a look at this little cartoon transit here. This is an Earth-sized planet transiting a sun-sized star in a much smaller orbit. As such, shallow transits only decrease the brightness of stars by about 100 parts per million. And so we need precise space-based telescope to detect these types of signals, things like Kepler or TESS. And in fact, over the last few weeks, I've been working on a really quick little paper about some opportunities to observe the actual Earth transiting the sun with TESS, based on a random sort of late night Twitter exchange the other day. I'm not going to get much into it here, but the sunlight reflected off of Uranus is going to decrease as the Earth's shadow passes over that planet. And TESS is going to have the opportunity to measure Earth transit the sun in photometry, which I think is pretty fun. So keep an eye out on the archive and on Twitter for more about that fun kind of side project. But back to this cartoon, this is the Earth-sized planet transiting the sun-sized star. And I just want to swap out this 1 solar mass main sequence star for a 1 solar mass white dwarf really quick. And And this sort of highlights the problem with detecting planets around white dwarfs. They don't transit for the most part. White dwarfs are so small that the planet has to be extremely precisely tuned to our line of sight in order to transit the star. So aligning this and zooming in a bit more, we can explore a few observational properties of these transits. The main upside is that the transits are very deep. Instead of talking about parts per million flux decreases, now we're talking about tens of percent or possibly even total eclipses of white dwarf stars, as planets can actually be larger than the luminous stars in these systems. But there are many other downsides. White dwarfs are faint, and so it takes some glass or some time to get a lot of signal on them. These transits have extremely short durations. They only last about 1 minute. The orbit has to be very close to edge on, as I've mentioned, and the planets have to be fairly close in, because really distant planets can just never be edge on enough to transit, basically. But I say the time is ripe to discover these planets, because the amount of data we have now is finally beginning to outnumber the tiny amount of time that white dwarfs are in transit. So first of all, compared to this map, which shows the location of all white dwarfs known prior to Gaia DR2, you can really see the SDSS footprint here. Now with Gaia, we pretty much know where all of the white dwarfs are on the sky, because they have high parallaxes for their apparent magnitudes. And so we know where pretty much all the bright white dwarfs are. We also now, with the Zwicky Transient Facility, have time series photometry of most of these. ZTF has been, over the last few years, observing most of the sky 1,000 times over. So last year at this symposium, I did a little bit of back of the envelope math. I'm going to fly through this really quick. This is kind of a Drake equation type of thing. You could expect that maybe the number of transiting exoplanets we find roughly equal to the number of white dwarfs that we search for planets around, times the fraction of white dwarfs with planets, times the fraction of time that those planets can be detected, times the number of detection attempts. And if I put in some optimistic numbers here, we're looking pretty good. And if I put in some pessimistic numbers, we're still looking like we should be able to find these planets in this data set, where this is sort of the number of white dwarfs we are observing and the number of observations we have. These two numbers are large now, and so we can overcome how small these other numbers are. So, but the issue becomes one of finding a needle in a haystack. And this is the part of my talk that is called "It's Harder Than It Sounds." I'm showing an interactive scatter plot tool here that's available on my GitHub that I use to explore pandas data frames. It lets me plot any column versus any other column, and then click on the points to interact with the data. This way I can measure a bunch of different variability metrics for the objects I'm interested in. I've highlighted one of these points here that then I'm able to plot the light curve for and acquire imaging data. This represents, as a function of Gaia magnitude, how deep of a point there is below the average brightness of the star in terms of magnitude. And in this particular example, we see this is a known dwarf nova, huge changes in brightness all the time. You see it going through an outburst. It's very variable, but it's not what I'm looking for, and it's easy to identify and reject. Over here, there's another point that has extremely high, highly significant dips in it, but there's some sort of very strange, very small error bars here at low magnitude. This is like digital garbage. So again, not what I'm looking for, but here is a light curve that looks quite like what I'm interested in, a couple of deep and significant dips that could be individual transits being captured. And so I'll inspect this this deepest dip here and really zoom in, and you see there's an image artifact here that's causing me some trouble. This star in the middle is leaking flux along this column. And it turns out that the vast majority of compelling transit signals in the light curve data come from image artifacts like this. So this has really been a pain. And these have to be manually and subjectively vetted before we go to the telescope and start following any of these things up. And I've got a pretty good machinery for doing that, but it's also led me to revisit my strategy for detecting these transiting planets. I'm beginning, I'm sort of redoing my analysis now, focusing on non-detections. And these are times when the exposure history metadata says that we really should have detected a white dwarf at if it were significantly faint. Sorry, we should have detected a white dwarf if it were at its regular brightness. But because of just the detection threshold of our images, perhaps we don't detect it in some observations because of transits. And this explains why at low, at fainter Gaia magnitudes, there's this real drop-off in deep transits, is because if these fainter objects are being transited, it's just putting them below the detection threshold. And so finally, I just want to wrap up with a couple of a little glimpse of some data of some promising systems I've been looking at lately. Here's an example of one transiting system. I followed up with the ARC 3.5 meter at Apache Point Observatory. Between these two images, one of these stars has completely disappeared. This is our white dwarf target, confirming a good detection from ZTF. And then here's another light curve from ZTF that I found recently that's very interesting, that shows what appears to be disintegrating planetesimal debris transiting a white dwarf star here over a time scale of sort of hundreds of days. And then there have been a couple of recent papers that I've contributed to, led by some colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin, exploring some other transiting debris systems that we've discovered in the ZTF data. One led by grad student Zach Vanderbosch, another sort of every 100 days kind of transiting system. And then another more recently led by undergraduate Joseph Goudry, who's detected a number of other similar debris-like systems. So some pretty exciting work here I encourage you to look into. So thanks for your time. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Keaton. What questions do folks have for Keaton? I see a hand from Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Keaton. So do you expect TESS to do more work discovering some of these? I know there was the giant planet one. Is it an issue of cadence that's going to keep TESS from finding all of these, or is it something else?
It's a good question. Yeah, so there was, and I didn't have time to include this, there was an announcement of a planet candidate transiting a white dwarf from TESS. This is I was actually surprised by that signal quite a bit. There's TESS, it's a cadence issue, a signal to noise issue. I've been working with a lot of the TESS data on white dwarf stars, in particular looking at pulsating white dwarfs, but we can't go much fainter than around 18th magnitude for those to get good signal. And so there's just not the number of white dwarfs that are brighter than 18th to do that kind of work. This is a kind of a candidate giant planet. It might be a brown dwarf. The data are consistent with that. I've looked at the ZTF data for those for that system, and there are a couple significant, barely significant dips from these grazing transits, but nothing that would really stand out to me as super interesting given all the ZTF data I've seen. Yeah.
Okay. Great, thanks. We have time for a really quick question, maybe from Patrick, and I'll aggressively cut off discussion at the 30-second mark.
My question might not be all that brief, but I can ask it, I suppose. I was just kind of curious based on the, I was interested in these enriched white dwarfs, and this may be a little off topic, but I was curious if you could, from the rate that material, falls below the photosphere, if you could sort of invert the problem and put like a lower limit on the amount of planets or planetary material or something like that, sort of approaching the fraction of planets around stars from maybe the reverse end. Maybe that's a little crazy, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about that. I know there's some interesting work, in trying to back out what type of molecular compounds could have created the observed atmospheric contamination and such. But I don't know if the planet rate has been constrained in much detail from that. It's a different thing. This is planetary debris that may be coming through a debris disk. Rather than intact planets, and how connected those are, we're not sure.
Right. Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm gonna give Keaton some applause. And then we'll transition. Paul, are you online?
Yep.
Awesome.
Let's see. Trying to. There we go. Okay, can you see the screen?
See the screen? Take it away.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks for hanging in there, everyone. I'm Paul Dalba, and I'm an NSF Fellow over at UC Riverside in Southern California. And today we'll continue to talk on exoplanets, and we'll specifically focus on giant exoplanets, and specifically from there, the longest period giant exoplanets that are known to transit, and been measuring the masses of those objects. So to make a little bit of a case for why I want to do this, I'll give this image as an argument. So this is a snapshot out of a video. And this video asks the question of what would it look like if you took every known exoplanet as of a couple of years ago, and you put them in orbit around a single star, and then you pan out to see what the scale of all the orbits looks like. Well, it's a pretty overwhelming video, as you could imagine. But when you get onto the scale of about an AU or so, this is what it looks like. Each of these dotted or little dotted lines is a single orbit, and then each of these blurry circles is a planet, as if it all orbited the same star. And within that white dashed line that I'm showing are over half of the exoplanets that we know of, well within the orbit of Mercury. And then when you step out to the orbit of Mercury, almost 80% of the exoplanets that we know of are within that distance of their host stars. And as you step out further, we actually know less and less about all of those planets. The problem is amplified as you keep zooming out on the order of 10 AU. Now we're getting out to the order of the giant planets in our own solar system. As you can expect, those are the kinds of planets I'm really interested in. But here we can even count the individual planets, and even less is known about them. So there's a little bit of a knowledge gap between planetary science in the solar system and exoplanet science, partially just because we're not finding planets on the same orbital scales. So that's what my work addresses. To show this graphically, this is a plot of planet mass as a function of planet semi-major axis, and then all the different colors are all the fun different exoplanet discovery techniques. The orange ones are all the transiting planets, and for those, the transit gives us the radius, and then we can go back with techniques like the radial velocity method and then measure the mass. And the RV planets are all in blue, and I've highlighted them. Now, there are orange planets that sit in that black rectangle that are in there. They just haven't had their masses measured. And they're hard to measure their mass because they're farther from their host star. It takes longer and the signals are smaller, but they're there. And these are stepping stones between the really hot giant planets that we've discovered, these hot Jupiters you've heard about, and then Saturn and Jupiter. And so characterizing those stepping stones it's an important task. So the main thing of my NSF fellowship is a survey to do that kind of characterization. And I've came up with the name. I came up with the name recently. I should have come up with it at the very beginning. But the name we have is the Giant Outer Transiting Exoplanet Mass Survey, or the GOTM survey. And the goals of the survey we can break down just by going through the acronym. So first and foremost, it is a giant exoplanet mass survey. So planet masses are really one of the most important pieces of the puzzle of understanding how planets form, what their interiors might be made of, how they migrate from their point of formation to where we see them now, and then how that affects the entire system. Because if you bring something like Jupiter from 10 AU into 0.1 AU, all of that mass and all that angular momentum are certainly going to affect anything else going on in the system. So giant exoplanet mass surveys have been happening before. They've very successfully characterized many exoplanet systems, and they've characterized systems all the way from 0.1 AU all the way out to 10 AU. So they've gone across pretty much all orbital scales. But the thing that makes the GOTAM survey a little special is that it's focusing on these transiting planets. And with the transiting planets, we get the radius. Mass and radius together give us composition. It gives us information about heavy element mass that's within the planet. And that's where all the science lies, at least for giant exoplanets. And transiting giant planet surveys have really only focused on this inner 0.1 AU of systems, partially because the transit probability falls off as you go further out, but partially just because it's hard to do and it takes a while. So the final point about GOTAM is that it focuses on those outer planets, those ones that are moored around 1 AU. It's prohibitively difficult to get out to the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. But with these 1 AU giant planets, we can answer the question of, do giant outer planets form or migrate differently than those that are much closer or much farther from their host stars? So I'll show you the members of the GOTAM survey as of so far. This is a plot of radius. It's a function of orbital period. And all the gray points are all the known transiting exoplanets. And the red data points are the relatively small, but still very significant sample of the GOTAM survey. And they're all on the order of 100 to 1,000 days. That means they go around their star once every 100 to 1,000 days. And to characterize them, measure their masses, you need to see at least one full orbit, sometimes two or more. So doing this kind of work on a 3-year postdoc is challenging, but it is doable. And I'll explain how I've managed to do that. So for these points, the red points are from Kepler. The blue points, the little T's, are actually planets from TESS that are new to the GOTAM survey and offer their own challenges. But for all of these planets, I have programs on Keck High-Res and on the Automated Planet Finder Telescope, or the APF, which is at Lick Observatory, Mount Hamilton. There are about 15 giant planet candidates, or what I'll say validated exoplanets. They've been statistically validated based on more or less photometry alone. That's very problematic for giant planets. They have like a 50% false positive rate. So if you hear someone talking about a long period validated planet, assume it's a brown dwarf or some sort of false positive until someone shows you the mass. But 15 giant planets in this radius range, or in this period range, is a significant increase, a 50% increase in what's been done previously. And there's a lot of science to be done there. And an important part of this program is that the APF is Q observing. So the cadence can be spread out over entire semesters, over entire years, because oftentimes in a single night, I only need one 20-minute spectrum. I don't need to spend the entire night observing my targets. I just need little bits of time spaced out over 2 years. And that's even harder to do with Keck because you're awarded half nights or full nights. But I do time sharing with a couple different planet hunting groups, including the California Planet Search and the TESS Keck survey. And that allows me to get specific cadences of RV observations that are needed to do this, which is another huge hurdle in characterizing these kinds of planets. So for the fainter Kepler targets, I use Keck to characterize them. And as a refresher, Keck observed relatively faint stars in one field of sky over about 4 years. And that's different from TESS, which is observing now, the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, which observes bright stars over the entire sky, but only observes chunks of sky in about 28-day sectors, which really hinders finding long-period planets. What that means for TESS is that we end up with a lot of single transit events where we just have one single transit, as opposed to Kepler that stared for 4 years. And so you can see 2 transits, even for some pretty long-period planets. So with Kepler, it's all about a game of sampling the RV phase curve just right to get the mass constrained. And with TESS, it's just about finding the single transits. I do a lot of collaborating with the citizen scientists to find events that look like planets, get RVs on it as quickly as possible, and then try to start a baseline for the mass. And that's a little bit riskier. But those are the 2 programs that I run. And in the next couple slides, I'm just going to run you through 2 of the planet discoveries I'm working on now. The first paper from the GOTAM survey already came out, but these 2 are ones that are coming out soon. And they're really exciting, and they make the final point that I'd like to make. On the left, we have a Kepler target. It's KOI 375b. And on the right, we have a TESS target, and it's HD 238894b. It's also got a TOI number. So on the left, Kepler saw 2 pretty short duration transits that were separated by 989 days. Most transiting exoplanets are 10 days. So we are 2 orders of magnitude farther out with this. So this is a difficult and very exciting. On the right, we just have one 24-hour long transit from this HD 238894b planet. And that was in 1 year of TESS observations. This thing happened to be near the TESS continuous viewing zone. So these are 2 very exciting candidates to get RVs on. And so here are the RV observations that I've taken with Keck on the left and APF on the right. So focusing on the left for KOI 375b, one of the reasons that can explain why such a long period planet has such a short transit, you would expect it to take a while to cross the face of its star. But one of the reasons why it could be going so quickly is that it has high eccentricity. And these data, which is RV as a function of orbital phase, and the best fit model, it's really cuspy. And that's because indeed there is super high eccentricity. It's about 0.92 with eccentricity. So this thing stays really far out away from its star at about 4 AU for most of the orbit, and then flies in the last second and whips around the star at around 0.2 AU for its periapse. It's not the most eccentric transiting exoplanet, but as far as apastron distance goes, it is certainly the farthest of any other one discovered. Now for the HD 238894b, this is kind of what the game looks like. You just take data point by data point and you wait to see these things turn around. You wait to see the signal come out. And so this is what the game's been like over the last couple of years. But we've measured something that's a couple Jupiter masses. It also has a moderate eccentricity, not quite as high as KOI 375b, but they're similar in mass. There's several Jupiter masses. But the difference in eccentricities and the difference in the fact that the 238894 has some sort of companion because there's an acceleration we've measured, and KY 375 doesn't have a companion. These things probably migrated differently. They've had different migration pathways. This brings me to the sort of result I'd like to present, at least a preliminary result right now for Gotham. It's not quite done. But the idea is, in trying to understand how giant planets form, it's known that more massive giant planets are known to have more heavy elements, anything heavier than helium. And relative to their stars, their metal enrichment in giant planets decreases with planet mass. These are 2 trends that are predicted by the core accretion model of formation for giant planets. And indeed, all the Gotham planets I've characterized so far, the 2 I've shown and about 4 others, are consistent with that, which is as we expect. We expect planets like that and Jupiter and Saturn to have formed from core accretion. But the curious thing is that beyond that, there's no additional correlation of the metal content, heavy element content of these planets with eccentricity, with current orbital period, or with the presence of an outer companion, be it a star or be it a large planet. And that's curious because those things directly translate into different migration pathways. So if these things are migrating from where they formed to where they are now differently, we might expect, there are predictions that would expect that the metal content would be different. But I'm not finding any correlation with that so far. So what that might be saying, again, preliminary interpretation of a small number of data points here, but what this might be saying is that vastly different migration pathways and outcomes leave no distinguishing evidence in heavy element composition. So that heavy element composition might be something unifying amongst all giant planets, whether they're at 10 days, 100 days, 1,000 days, or whether they're Jupiter. And that would be an interesting constraint for formation theories. So I think I have a couple minutes left. And so I want to transition really quickly to just speaking a little about the broader impacts portion of my fellowship that I've done so far. And so this is a no threshold introductory computer programming course that I taught at a city college here in Riverside. So I'd just like to share what it is and then the result from the first time I ran it. So this was a 100% free course offered to all students at this community college here in Riverside, Riverside City College. And RCC, it's a Hispanic serving institution. And Riverside County, if you're not familiar with this area of California, it's about 50% Hispanic or Latinx. So one of the purposes of offering this course is to try to increase representation from this underrepresented group in STEM fields. But it was open to all students. It wasn't necessarily just STEM students. It was anyone interested in programming. And I say no threshold because I literally tried to have no prerequisites. You didn't even need a computer. Computers were provided in the classroom. And all the computers in the library, I manually installed Python on myself. So tried to take away all the thresholds. And at the end of it, you receive a certificate that you can take either to continue on in the computer science major, you can take to an employer, you can take to research opportunities, things like that. So this is my last slide. Outcomes from the course, it went really great, I feel. There was a lower student attrition rate than other computer science courses at this community college, even despite the pandemic, which we had to go online for. So I'm really, really proud about that. And the student reported skill improvement based on a sort of a before and after rate your own skills ranged from increase of 0 to an increase of 4 with a median of 1.6, which I think was pretty good. And I received a lot of positive construction. And this fun figure I'm showing is an activity I said, use Matplotlib to draw a face. It can be very simple, but just get familiar with the plotting tools and data visualization tools. And this is what one student submitted, which totally blew me away. And this is representative of all the work the students did. I was really, really happy with it. Okay, I'm out of time. This is an acknowledgement slide. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks so much, Paul. We have time for one question. Two if they're really fast. Probably only. The questions do folks have? I see a hand from Patrick.
So coming back to this notion that all the inner Jupiters seem to have a sort of indistinguishable, I suppose, end result. I'm trying to figure out what that would mean then in terms of the planet formation process. Does that mean that they all have to form from, say, within or outside of the same ice line, or because different things freeze out, dust grains and whatnot will look different in different parts of the disk. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what that would then mean for the planet formation process.
Yep, so there's already the idea that planets are going to be forming outside the ice line, or perhaps it's some sort of pile up near the ice line where material is. So this might be reinforcing that point that all planets are at least accreting their heavy elements there in the same way and at the same rate based on their mass. And it may also be pointing to the fact that they're doing that before they then have the majority of their migration pathway. So maybe this is a very early on process and then migration happens after the fact. And it doesn't matter how you migrate because you've already accreted those materials. So that is possibly the direction.
And would it point to sort of say one ice line that's sort of the primary responsibility for this, or because there's multiple different ice lines, I guess. Anyway, I'll stop.
This is really great discussion, and I want to encourage it to continue. And I'm going to gently nudge it onto the Slack channel if that's okay.
Thank you.
No problem, but I very much encourage it to continue. Okay, next, Christina, are you there?
Yep. Let me work on sharing.
Oh, and applause for Paul. I can play my applause soundtrack. Okay, well, we can see your slides.
Okay. Thanks all for sticking with us till the nearish end. I am Christina K. Davis, and I'm at UCSB. And I'm going to talk to you about this algorithm that I've been working on implementing for better imaging of exoplanets, particularly direct imaging of exoplanets. So I'll start by showing you, let me get the pointer. This is our first directly imaged companion with mech on sitting behind the Subaru Skexeo adaptive optics instrument. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. This is yet to be published, so top secret. But it's highlighted down here in red. And if we break down this image a little bit more, you can see that we've got the central coronagraph obscuration. So this is a coronagraph shadow here in the middle that blocks 99% of our on-axis starlight. We also are using our adaptive optics system to diffract some of the starlight into these satellite speckles, which here, this is a broadband image, and so they look chromatically elongated due to the diffraction nature of the on-axis starlight. And we use these for calibration, including photometer calibration. But then we have this kind of donut, and this is what we call the so-called speckle halo. And I'll talk a lot about what speckles are and how they arise, but they are the dominant source of noise contributing to the signal contrast between our exoplanet signal and our background. And, this really limits how dim of planets we can see and how separate, what the separation is that we can identify exoplanets. And so what you can even see between our companion, spoiler alert, this is a brown dwarf. It's not actually an exoplanet, but it's our first discovery, which is still pretty cool for us. But you can see it here. This is even dimmer than this other speckle signal. And so what my research is to be able to identify speckles in these images in real time so that we can apply, effectively remove these signals from our post-process data. So here I'm going to show a movie. Over here on the left is our instantaneous data frames. And you can see the speckle signal jump around in the background and build up into this integrated halo that you can see on the right. This is a different data set than what I showed you previously. And I think I'll play it one more time. But these speckles are caused by atmospheric turbulence, and so they have characteristic timescales based on the atmospheric turbulence above the telescope when these are getting performed. And so we're showing 0.5 second integration times, although the speckles can live either much longer or much shorter. There's a couple different mechanisms that are involved. But what we need to do is probe the speckle at a much faster time than they appear so that we have enough time to remove it before that speckle evolves and goes away. So this work is really enabled by the MKID detectors on our camera. So I'm working with MEC, which is the MKID exoplanet camera, and also with SketchAO, the Subaru Coronagraphic Extreme AO system. And there's a bunch of advantages to MKIDs over traditional CCDs or even EMCCDs. But what I want to highlight is that they are in the single photon counting regime, where we can record photon arrival time to within 0.1 microsecond precision. And so our data products don't actually look like a traditional image that you would get from, say a CCD. We actually get just photon lists where we have, X, Y, pixel location, photon energy, and arrival time. And that allows us to make temporal data cubes where we can have arbitrarily large or small temporal bins where we can see these atmospheric speckles that live on really short time scales that we can even match to the frame refresh rate of our deformable mirror. So here we have the basic AO cartoon, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but I'll go over it really quickly. When we look through our telescope at a star, we see starlight that is not represented by a pure plane wave. It's been aberrated by the atmosphere. We sense that by using not a beam splitter, a dichroic, where we send some of the light into a wavefront sensor, which reconstructs this phase of our incoming starlight and figures out what command to apply to the DM to basically undo that phase aberration. And so a very nearly perfect, but not entirely flat wavefront gets passed, where we have, very minute AO residuals that are there because we don't have our DM only has a limited number of modes to correct for this aberration effects. But these residuals interfere with other aberrations from our optics downstream of our beam splitter, and also from diffraction around the coronagraph. to give us that speckle signal. And here I just want to point out this is the actual Subaru, the Skexeo instrument with mech sitting behind it. And this whole system gets picked up and craned to interchange with the other instrument at the Naismith platform here. And this is kind of a pain in my neck of waiting for time in between limited time on Subaru. So all of you AAPF fellows who are observing with Hyper Supreme Cam, I'm very jealous of your time. So here, what we can do though with these images is when we're looking for our companions, one of the advantages of MPIS is we can get spectral information. And so comparing the spectra of these signals, which are in fact diffracted starlight, and so they do have a star-like spectra, we can compare those to our companion spectra. And so you can see here that this is a very poorly reconstructed black body, but you can tell that they're different enough to distinguish a companion from a satellite spots. So what I've been doing with my AAPF is for the first couple of years, I did a lot of simulation work, building the capabilities of CDI into a pre-existing simulation base called METIS. And what the CDI algorithm actually does is it takes the deformable mirror and puts a known probe. So this is while the DM is actually still doing its aberration correction, we superimpose these probes onto the DM, and they will create this modulation in these two symmetrical regions in the focal plane on either side of the PSF core. And so what we do is we modulate the intensity of any speckles in these two regions by changing the phase of these probe patterns. And then there's an algorithm. I decided not to show you the equation because nobody wants equations. But with that modulation, we can tell the phase of that signal. And with our complex data, we can then remove the speckle signal, anything that's modulated with our diffracted starlight from the probe gets modulated, and then we know that it is coherent with our on-axis signal, whereas planetary light is incoherent. So I take a series of probes. Each probe has a symmetric pair 180 degrees away, and through the images in the focal plane with all these probes, these probe phases modulating the intensity, we can reconstruct what the speckle signal is and then remove it from a series of null images where we're not probing in order to remove the speckle signal there. So that's my simulation work. What does this look like on the telescope? We have over here on the left data from MEC, and granted the pixel count on this camera has something to be desired. But we do see that when here when I'm not probing with the DM, we get a very constant signal. And then when I start probing, you'll see this light kind of dance around, the intensity increases, and we then use that to reconstruct what's going on in for CDI. So over here on the left, you can see there's sometimes we're constructively interfering, sometimes destructively interfering compared to our null signal. But we do in certain regions of this focal, certain pixels in the camera get very consistent probe cycles throughout the whole imaging array compared to one of pixel with no probe kind of in this middle region here. And so this is showing us that we're hooking up, we're probing correctly and looking for the right sort of signals. So these are my best results so far, and I realize they don't jump out at you at looking significantly darker in these regions here. But over here on the right is a bunch of these null images summed up before we apply the CDI subtraction, and this is post. Like I said, not super great, but you can identify regions where we are actively, not actively, but in post-processing, removing some of this speckle signal. And so there's a lot of work here still to be done in terms of both how can we do a better job at probing some of the signal? Can we change our integration times? Can we change the probe amplitudes? Do some adaptive thresholding to get better signal into this region, to do more, to take out some of these speckles in other regions of this probe, and also then making everything run faster and in real time. But we're getting there, working on it, and so stay tuned. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for a great talk. What questions do folks have for Christina? So I have at least one. So these MKIDs, can you remind me, these are cryogenic? So all this happens in a cryostat, which I guess probably makes this really hard.
Yeah. So unlike CCDs, which they're better cooled, MKIDs are superconducting devices, and so they sit in liquid helium cryostats, and in particular MKIDs, depending on what specific material you make them out of, they want to be as cold as possible, not just at 4K. And so we're running our cryostat as close as we can get to 100 millikelvin, which is cold, but you gain a whole lot in single photon counting abilities. And we have a closed fridge, and so we can actually cool down in about an hour, and we have a hold time of about 24 hours. And so we can cool down even when we're sitting not attached to the telescope. And so a lot of the data that I've shown you is actually just on a white light source in the, when we're sitting, during daylight hours, which gives us a lot of time for testing, even though we don't have a whole lot of time for on-sky verification. So yeah, that's been one of my big challenges is time availability, and because the instrument gets picked up, there's a whole host of things that get unplugged and replugged in by hand every time that moves, which is once every 3 weeks or so. And not every day do people actually go up to the summit of Mauna Kea. And so if there's something unplugged, it's just a whole nother 24 hours or sometimes even longer, depending on, the turnaround time to get somebody up there just to, plug in a USB. So
yeah, it's
difficulties of instrumentation and remote observing. All combined.
No, that's great. Really challenging. Thank you so much for a nice talk. I will play some applause, and thank you so much. Okay, and then I think we have one talk. Last but certainly, we saved the best for last, or especially this last session here. Patrick, are you online?
I am. Let me share my screen. Is everybody able to see a normal looking presentation? All right, perfect. Thanks everyone for sticking around to the end, and hopefully I'll live up to the best for last moniker, I suppose. But it's been a really great to hear all the work everyone's been involved in. I'm Patrick. I'm a first year fellow at Northwestern University, and I tend to be interested in looking for signs of planet formation and ongoing planet formation in some of the youngest protostellar disks. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I spent a lot of last summer and fall doing. But before diving too much into that, I wanted to back up and kind of give a little bit of an overview and a bit of the jargon. I'm going to talk a bit about the jargon I'm going to probably slip into during my talk. So I've shown here sort of the cartoon picture of our general understanding of the star and planet formation process. You start with some sort of cloud of gas and dust that collapses under the force of gravity. And because of conservation of angular momentum, you end up forming a disk around the star. And that kind of goes through a few stages where you have this sort of young forming disk that still has this collapsing infalling envelope of material in. But by the time that's sort of dispersed or fully accreted, you're left with this what we call protoplanetary disk that's left exposed to the world. And we've sort of historically tended to call these protoplanetary disks because this is where we have long thought that planets would be forming. And these tend to be ages of about 1 to 10 million years or so. And so because this is where we thought planets would have long thought planets would be forming, we spent a lot of time trying to understand their bulk properties, particularly in the last decade or so, since ALMA has come online. And with its sensitivity, it's really made an industry out of just large surveys of protoplanetary disks. So I'm just showing examples of a handful of these different surveys that have surveyed the entire population, essentially, of protoplanetary disks in a handful of different star forming regions. And so we're really starting to be able to kind of get a general picture of how much mass is in these disks, how big they are, and so on, which is really informative for the star formation process, the planet formation process. And sort of one of the things that I've been particularly interested in, and one of the interesting results that a lot of folks have spent the last 5 years or so on, is understanding the disk mass distributions of protoplanetary disks. So I'm showing the cumulative distribution of disk mass. This is, I should note, dust mass in a handful of different star forming regions. And this in and of it by itself isn't, I mean, if you know what to look at, is informative, but to kind of guide the eye, I've shown a few measures, very simplistic measures of what you might consider sort of the planet formation potential of these disks. So in red is the minimum mass solar nebula, roughly how much dusty material you would have needed to form something like the solar system. In green is something like what we think maybe the mass of giant planet cores might be. And in cyan, what the mass of roughly of a super Earth would be. And what's sort of been interesting about this is that what we found in the last 5 years or so is that a significant fraction, 50% or more of protoplanetary disks don't even seem to have enough mass in the entire disk to form even a super Earth, which has created a little bit of tension with the set of the exoplanets that we're actually detecting these days. And I need to be a little more careful about this because I know there's at least one paper coming out that has done a very careful job of trying to account for biases in different surveys and such, and can better align these numbers. But a lot of it depends too on what your sort of efficiency of turning disk mass into planets is. This assumes all of the mass in the disk goes into planets, and so there's a little bit of a tension there. And then the perhaps most exciting thing that's come out of the last 5 years with ALMA is that basically every single protoplanetary disk that's been looked at with high enough angular resolution has shown a lot of these what we call substructures, these rings, gaps, spiral arms, asymmetries that you see over here. And there's a lot of debate about what these features might come from. A lot of people like to associate them with planets. I take the sort of more broad approach of we don't know if these are planets or not, but I think one way or another, this is telling us that planet formation is already well underway in these disks. And so I'd posit that protoplanetary disks are really not primordial. By the time you get to these sort of 1 to 10 million year old disks, there's been a lot of disk evolution, dust grain growth, and other things that have happened. And so if you really want to know sort of the initial conditions from which all of planet formation comes from, then you have to start looking at younger and earlier disks. And so if we go back to sort of the picture that I showed earlier of the star formation process, that means you have to start looking at these less than 1 million year old or so disks that are still embedded in their natal envelope. And so I'm going to try to, generally it's a silly jargony thing, but we tend to call these either embedded disks or protostellar disks. I don't know if my Zoom controls are blocking that or not. It's in these really young disks then that it seems like the initial conditions for planet formation should be found. And sort of historically, it's been somewhat difficult to study these disks, particularly when we've had only, say, low resolution telescopes, because you have to worry about what emission is coming from the envelope and what emission is coming from the disk. And so it's sort of been challenging to separate the two and understand what's actually going on in the disk. Oops, there we go. But with ALMA coming online, we've actually started to, the high resolution has really helped quite a lot with that. And we've been, in the last few years even, started to be able to take these really nice high resolution images of young embedded disks. And we sort of surprisingly, I think, found that even in these young, less than 1 million year old disks or so, these substructures are still showing up. So we're seeing things like rings, spiral arms, cavities, and so on, which is I think tells us something interesting about the processes, when the processes that go on in planet formation start. And so what I want to focus on is this sample of 7 protostellar disks that were found as a part of the Van Dam Orion survey to have substructures in them, mostly in the forms of these large rings, but asymmetries and inner disks show up as well. And this was sort of an interesting survey because it was sample because it was the first, it's been so far the largest sample of these young protostellar embedded disks to have substructures in them. And the main question I've sort of been interested in trying to ask in looking at these is how early do these substructures form? You might say, oh, well, okay, they're in these young disks, they're forming less than 1 million years. But in terms of planet formation theories, there's a lot of difference between 100,000 years and 500,000 years, or do these things really just start to show up at 1 million years old or so? And so we really like to understand at what point do these features start to show up. And measuring ages for these systems is really challenging in a lot of ways. So the way I generally try to approach it is by looking at the physical properties of the system, namely in this particular case, how much mass is in the envelope versus how much mass is in the disk, because you would sort of expect with time that the envelope should be depleted. And so something like your envelope mass to disk mass ratio should go down with time. It's a rough measure and probably not perfect, but can at least give us some handle on how old these systems might be. Since I don't have a whole lot of time, I don't have a timer up, but I'm guessing I don't have many minutes left. I try to do this with detailed radiative transfer modeling, where we fit multiple multi-wavelength data sets with real physical models that we can back out parameters for the system. And what that means is then we can put the sources on plots like this that show, say, the envelope mass over the ratio of the envelope mass to the disk mass, and where sources that are really quite young or should be over here on the right with really large massive envelopes, and sources that are much older and perhaps closer to 1 million years old or so should fall sort of in this really low envelope mass range. And so if we do that for the sample of 7 sources that I was looking at here, they sort of fall all over the place. There's some that seem to have these really massive envelopes compared to their disks, and some that really don't have all that much envelope mass left. But where this was sort of interesting for me is that if we put sort of the general range of envelope mass to disk mass ratios that sources that had been previously observed to have these substructures, they tend to fall sort of on the lower envelope mass side. And so what I think we're seeing here with a few of these sources, in particular, say these two, is that we're seeing some of the youngest sources in which these types of features have shown up yet to date, which is starting to put sort of interesting timescales on the when things that might be related to planet formation start to happen. So I think the major caveat to this is, some of these features are really quite large. I haven't given you size scales, but say this gap is, I think, 100 AU or so in radius. Some of them are much smaller, tens of AU, but that raises the question, you know, can a single planet carve such a large gap, or maybe are we looking at young binaries? You might even see by eye that some of the inner disks, when they're present, almost look like they're a little bit offset, which might be suggesting that there's some sort of massive companion perturbing the primary star. And so we tried to do some detailed fitting, and indeed it does seem like they are, these features are sort of offset in a more rigorous way. So we've been trying to see whether we can find any evidence that there's actually a companion in these disks. We looked at archival HST imaging, and nothing has really shown up, though you can probably see that the resolution in most of these cases is just barely enough to be able to say anything. And so what I've been working on really actually in the last couple of weeks, because data has been coming in, has been to go to the VLA and look for, say, signatures of free emission from young stars at really high angular resolution to see if we can find any evidence that there's multiple sources in these cavities. And so far we've detected single sources. I haven't done the astrometry yet to see where these actually fall, but we haven't seen any clear evidence of multiplicity yet. So there's still a lot to do there. That's very preliminary, but I think I'm probably at this point close to out of time. So I'll stop and take any questions.
Thanks so much. You're spot on. You have 6 seconds left. So it's perfect.
Perfect. I tried to go quickly because I knew I was going to be over. So hopefully it wasn't too fast.
It was great. What questions do folks have for Patrick? Okay, I have one. So it's interesting because what you're getting at here is, basically how solar systems form, right? And I wonder if there are examples of sort of what happens when you catch them in between. Like do you you obviously know what our solar system looks like, and then you see what what maybe these nascent ones are, but are there examples of things in between? Like, do you catch them as they transition? Can you resolve what's happening in these disks? Or do you really just see voids? And there's a lot in that question. So respond to none of it. Yeah,
that's a good question. And so far, to some degree, the state of the art is this, where we're seeing, these gaps showing up in handful of million-year-old systems. There's been one single case of a disk found around a baby planet. But sort of the problem, I think, that it's been difficult is these disks disperse on timescales of 10 million years, and then you're left with your high contrast imaging and other techniques, which I think also have more trouble with young stars. So I wouldn't say there's been a lot. There's been a handful. And there's not, and you can't get all that close in. So I think we're kind of pushing up against the limits of what we're able to do with current technology. But it's kind of an interesting question of how do we bridge that gap if we see a lot of planets, and most of the planets that we see are on much smaller scales, and then we see at young times these gaps showing up that might be planets, but these are on 10, 20, 30 AU, and how do we figure out what's in between? I think it's going to take, on the radio end, I think something like the next generation VLA or ALMA 2030 to start to push into smaller scales, and probably a lot of the work that we've been hearing about from others to put on the other end to try and push to larger separation planets and younger things and fainter things as well. So I know that's kind of a dodge answer, but
I know, it's great. It's great. Thank you. I see a hand. Oh, maybe Kate put her hand out.
Well, I think you kind of answered my question. I was wondering, you said your age proxy is just the envelope to disk ratio. Is there anything else that would be sort of the holy grail, or is it, that's sort of your end game?
I think it's tough. I'm not an expert on measuring ages. That the way these things are typically done, more generally is counting statistics. So I think, other more accurate age estimators can get you down to 10-ish or so million years. And then from there, you start playing around with counting statistics. And so I don't know of any surefire ways to get the ages. And part of the problem here is particularly for these things this young, for most of these sources, we can't actually even detect the photosphere. So, we're JWST and some other, and the next generation of large telescopes might help with that. But I don't know of anything that's surefire that has been proposed to do a great job. But, you get, I guess for the slightly older things, you put them on pre-main sequence evolutionary tracks, and that's mostly limited by how well you can do photometry. So perhaps if I had to guess, maybe if we could start to get accurate young tracks for really young stars and get good photometry for them and photosphere spectral types, that'll probably help some.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna offer some applause. Maybe if I can offer the applause. So thank you so much. So I think we're formally in break. So let's go ahead and have 9 minutes of break, and let's be back at 3:30 Eastern sharp for some closeout discussion. We need to hand off. I want to just take some time to thank everyone, and then we have some closeout discussion, and then Herschel is going to try and join us for some more programmatic discussion if he can. But we'll hopefully he'll pop in. So with that, yeah, we'll see everyone back in 8 minutes. Bye. 8 minutes.
My dog doesn't want to hang out in my office right now because there's a really nice sunbeam in the living room, and Michigan winters don't really get too much like direct sun. So she's down there.